Hello and welcome to another video. I'm Chris Chen, the Vineyard Advisor for the North Coast regions of California with University of California Cooperative Extension. And today we're going to be talking about mothballed vineyards. So mothballing vineyards is the process of taking grapevines out of production without fully removing them from the field. And it's more challenging than it sounds. Mothballing means keeping the vines in the ground without them becoming a nuisance to neighbors, yourself, or wildlife or anything else like that. So mothballing is actually something that we need to think about before we do it and plan it out properly. Otherwise, we end up with a lot more challenges than we started with.
So what is mothballing as a concept, as a broader term? Well, it was a term first coined in the early 2000s by Australian wine grape producers and has caught on since then, and can be formally defined as maintaining a non-producing vineyard with minimal critical inputs to allow for a rapid return to production in the future. And there's some key points in that definition that I want to point out. The first is maintaining a non-producing vineyard, which means that the vineyard is not expected to produce fruit for harvest, but we still need to maintain it to some degree to make sure it does not become a nuisance to our neighbors or ourselves, for that matter. We also want to look at the minimal critical inputs aspect of the definition, which means that we want to keep the vines alive. How do we do that? We still have to provide some inputs, being irrigation, fertilization, stuff like that. And then to allow for a rapid return to production in the future. That means all of this maintenance is not just for pest and disease control. You're maintaining a non-producing vineyard also for the purpose of bringing it back into production quickly when you decide to do so. Now, all this is in contrast to the term abandonment, which suggests that there is no maintenance, there is no inputs, and there is really no plan for a return to production. So that's the difference between a mothballed vineyard and an abandoned vineyard.
So here's an example of a mothballed vineyard. And you can tell it's a mothballed vineyard because of the small canopies and the lack of pruning that has been done in this vineyard. This and every other grapevine in this row has been mothballed, which means that it has been maintained to some degree, particularly for control of pests, reducing pest pressure, but it hasn't been farmed to the point where we would want to harvest this fruit. If we get a close-up on this fruit, you can see a lot of shot berries. There is some sunburn and some mold. Not something you would want to harvest. So mothballed vineyard, really, the main focus is to limit pest pressure for yourself, your neighbors, and any surrounding agriculture whatsoever. And that's what they've done here. And they've done that through simple management by integrating livestock. So this vineyard that I'm at had sheep run through this vineyard and defoliate the vines in spring, leading to what you see here, which is really small leaves. And I'll put my hand there for comparison. For a normal wine grape, these are very tiny leaves. And that's true across the whole canopy here, down the whole row. And that's because they were defoliated through livestock feeding. Now, why would you want livestock to eat your leaves? Well, the idea is to reduce the canopy size and the canopy density, because what you're doing is removing habitat for flying insect pests, crawling insect pests, and fungi to grow in that canopy, and hopefully in the process reducing the amount of pest pressure that this mothballed vineyard puts out to the rest of the surrounding environment. Now, not all livestock integration is good for mothballing. It can also be good for long-term slow removal of a vineyard. Grapevines will continue to put out leaves so long as you keep defoliating them and they have resources to do so. In this case here, we see this grapevine and all the ones behind it have been defoliated multiple times by multiple rounds of livestock feeding. And we can see that while there are still clusters, they are not really in the best shape. In addition, this grapevine does not have the same amount of leaves as the one we previously looked at that was correctly mothballed using livestock.
So we haven't really talked about the key practices related to mothballing yet. We have just seen how livestock can be integrated into a mothballed vineyard to help reduce canopy growth, but there are plenty of other practices that you can utilize to mothball your vineyard successfully. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. There are many more practices that could go in here, but these are some things that you can do as you're approaching mothballing and planning it out for the future. Livestock integration is one of those. We saw that in the previous clip. If the goats or sheep are allowed to graze on the grapevines themselves, as well as the cover crop and the weeds in the cover crop, that can help reduce pest pressure throughout the season and reduce the chances of higher pest pressure the next year. Because they're eating that habitat or the food source of those pests and diseases, that helps reduce their pressure. The intensity and duration of livestock grazing is really important, and that will modify how your mothballing practices come out in the end of the mothballing period. Longer grazing periods can lead to more defoliation. More defoliation can lead to fewer resources when the grapevine is supposed to come back into production. Another of these major practices that you can utilize to mothball your vineyard is reducing grower inputs. So this means irrigation and fertilizer the majority of the time. Less irrigation or no irrigation, depending on your soil conditions and your site conditions, can help produce smaller canopies, which are easier to manage in the long run, even in a production vineyard. For a mothball vineyard, smaller canopies means less habitat for mildews and flying insect pests. You also would like to reduce your fertilizer inputs. Preferably, you do not add fertilizer if you're not going to harvest your crop. This leads to less vegetative growth and fewer clusters that would eventually be abandoned in the vineyard anyways. Canopy management is another one of those key practices related to mothballing that we want to avoid. Canopy management is a very expensive process. It takes a lot of labor and a lot of time. So if we want to minimize the cost per acre to manage a vineyard, what we want to do is reduce or eliminate hand labor to manage the vine's canopies. Looking at the previous two practices highlighted here, reducing inputs and integrating livestock, hopefully those will help control your canopy enough that you do not feel like you need any hand labor to manage the canopies, but we are not going to be tucking shoots, we're not going to be raking shoots, we're not going to be shoot selecting, we're not going to be thinning clusters, and we're not even going to be pruning. Pruning is a very heavy labor cost, and we typically would only want to prune when we want to bring the grapevines back into production. And then the last key practice I'll highlight here is having a persistent cover crop. With fewer people in the vineyard, fewer management, and fewer eyes on it, weeds have a chance to grow a lot more successfully and produce seed and incorporate that seed into the seed bank, which could lead to a lot more weed pressure when you bring the grapevines back into production. So if you have a persistent cover crop that is self-seeding or reseeding, that can be very useful for competing with those weeds and preventing their growth or limiting their growth and reproduction in the long run.
So looking at these two vineyards brings me to a point in this video, and that's that mothballing a vineyard is a spectrum of management. You can go very far into the minimal management strategy and get as close to abandonment as you can without increasing pest pressure or increasing it that much. You can also work with things like livestock or low inputs of irrigation or fertilizer. And this can help you manage the grapevine, especially if you plan on returning it to production at some point. Now, this first set of grapevines that we looked at, it's not irrigated, it's not pruned, but we did have livestock run through that part of the vineyard for a certain amount of time. And that's not always a good thing, but in this case, they had those livestock run through and still allowed some form of canopy to develop afterwards. Those grapevines have photosynthetes, and they might be able to come back into production should the owner decide that's what they want to do. Now, our second set of grapevines, which are the ones behind me that we looked at, where there's very little foliage on them and the canopy is overgrazed, these may not be able to come back to production. And that's because there's no photosynthesis occurring in that grapevine right now. And if there is, it's very little because the leaves are so small. So far, we've looked at two different forms of mothballing, which both include livestock integration to help reduce pest pressure throughout the growing season without excessive labor or management practices by the grower. But we can see that the amount of grazing really affects the grapevine's foliage following that grazing during a mothball period. Now, what this means is that some of these grapevines have photosynthetes that are being produced by their canopy, that what's left of their canopy after grazing. Some of these grapevines, the other ones, do not have any leaves, and if they do, it's a handful of very tiny leaves, which means there are no carbohydrates going into that grapevine from this growing season. This has implications for coming back from mothballing or bringing the grapevines back into production. The grapevines that are allowed to have some canopy during mothballing most likely are going to be able to come back to production should the grower decide to do that. In contrast, the grapevines that were overgrazed, where there is no canopy and fruit is still ripening on the vine, has a pretty good chance of not being able to come back to a production level should the grower decide to bring them back to production. And that's because what we're doing is we're reducing the resources of that grapevine by having livestock feed on them, followed by more feeding on them, which doesn't allow for the grapevine to replace those resources lost through livestock grazing. So this is an important concept for mothballing, and that's everything you do for mothballing is somewhat on a spectrum. We want to make sure that we're taking the grapevines out of production. They don't need too much management, if any at all. But that can be achieved through, as you've seen here, livestock integration, but also low inputs, little or no irrigation, no nutrient applications. It can also be achieved through not pruning or not managing the canopy as a whole. So mothballing isn't a single approach. It is a set of changes in your inputs and your labor and management strategies that lead to low growth or no growth. And the way you want to do that is by planning out before you mothball your vineyard how long you're going to mothball it for, how you're going to mothball it, and when you're going to try to bring it back to production, if at all.
When we're trying to develop a plan to mothball our vineyard, there are several considerations we should look at before we actually write down what we want to do and implement it. To successfully mothball a vineyard, that plan should include the grapevine's physiology and phenology as a major component. So what are some of those major considerations? The first is that you should assume that there's no harvest planned during the mothball period. And because there's no harvest planned, we're not concerned about the fruit and how it's developing or the total yield or yield per acre. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the fruit does not become a habitat for pests, diseases, and other issues. It's also important to keep in mind that the yield and quality of the fruit is likely to decline severely, right? Quality is a subjective term, but we can say that overall the quality for the purpose of wine production will decline, the total yield will decline if we're pulling back on irrigation inputs, nutrient inputs, management practices, and all of that. So we should assume there is no harvest plan for these mothballed vineyards. To prune or not to prune, that's the question. Pruning, again, is a very expensive, costly endeavor. It does affect vine health though, right? So the more of these 1-year-old dormant buds we have, the better health of that shoot in the next season versus when we leave a bunch of dormant buds that may have grown a shoot and then still have a couple of secondary buds in them. When we leave those, they become latent buds. And when we need to return to production, we need those latent buds to replace the arm positions that we had before the mothballing period. Water use efficiency. Less water means less leaves, smaller canopy, and less to worry about in terms of habitat for pests and diseases. It also means that we need maybe less livestock integration or monitoring of the grapevine itself for pests and diseases. It also means less transpiration and photosynthesis for the grapevine on average. We've seen that when grapevines have fewer leaves, they can alter their stomatal density. So it may not be a 1-to-1 reduction in transpiration and photosynthesis, but it will be reduced if the canopy is severely deficient in foliage. And then the last aspect is your plan for recovery. How do you plan to come back to production? How do you plan to get that vine established in the correct architecture again? A lot of this will likely rely on latent buds and will take a couple of years.
So we've seen how livestock can be used to manage a mothballed vineyard. But there are other options when it comes to management of your grapevines when you don't want them in production. One of those options is inputs. The first couple of grapevines that we looked at in those separate vineyards were not irrigated. They were not fertilized. The only management practices done to those were livestock integration through feeding of sheep herds and other goats. In this vineyard where we are now, you can see behind me there is quite a bit of canopy. And that's because this vineyard, while unmanaged, as far as the canopy, is irrigated. It's not fertilized, but it is irrigated on a regular basis. So these grapevines are actually almost the same as the ones we just looked at, just with water. Now, if we're going to look at this vineyard, the irrigated mothballed vineyard, this could be considered a different form of mothballing. You can see that there have been no livestock integrations in this vineyard as the canopy is quite large. We can also see the older leaves on these grapevines, the ones that would have been eaten by livestock had they run through the vineyard and grazed on the grapevines themselves. So what does this larger canopy and irrigation input mean for mothballing? Well, these inputs of irrigation, but also of photosynthesis from the grapevines, means that the grapes have more resources to come back into production when the owner or the manager decides that it's time to bring these grapes back into production. They have all of these leaves. They are doing much more photosynthesis than the grapevines we saw that were grazed by sheep and goats. And that means that they'll have more carbohydrate reserves next spring to recuperate from this mothballing period should the grower decide to bring them back into production. So what does this vineyard and this style of mothballing mean for mothballing as a concept in vineyards? Well, if we looked at our first set of grapevines, they had livestock integration. Livestock integration is a great way to control canopies without additional human labor costs. In this case, we have an unpruned vineyard and a non-grazed vineyard as well. And that means we have a lot of foliage. All of that foliage needs to be managed in some way if we wanted to make this a production level vineyard, but it's not. Instead, what's going on is we're reducing irrigation inputs to minimum that the grapevine needs to continue to grow. We're not adding fertilizer, so these grapevines don't grow massive to the point where the canopy is out of control and a challenge to manage if we wanted to bring it back to production. One huge difference in a mothballed versus not mothballed vineyard is pruning. And you can see that these grapes have not been pruned. And we can see that pretty clearly here because the trunk is down here, the cordons are here, and your fruiting zone is very inconsistent. This makes it really hard to do any sort of hand harvest or any sort of hand management of the grapes themselves.
So as a quick aside, let's take a look at the difference in architecture between a pruned vine and an unpruned vine in the season following the potential pruning. So a pruned vine almost always has new dormant buds at the base of the shoot. These typically have primary buds. These primary buds are very fruitful and healthy and have primordia of leaves, shoots, and flowers or inflorescences already preformed in them, which helps improve the chances that you have good growth and good yield the following spring and summer. The pruned vine also tends to have a low fruiting zone and a uniform height for that fruiting zone. So this red line here, you can see that the fruiting zone, the area where most of our harvestable fruit is going to be, is all roughly the same height off the ground. It also allows for easy exposure to pesticide sprays and exposure to sunlight because we can do leafing all at the same height off the ground. And then a pruned vine will also have minimal permanent wood on it. Even a cordon trained vine will have less permanent wood than an unpruned vine will. Pruning removes extra tissue that will harden and lignify, and that limits habitat for pathogens like grapevine trunk diseases to persist in the more permanent wood of that grapevine. Pruning regularly also allows for smaller pruning cuts to be done rather than removal of large portions of a persistent shoot that was left unpruned the year before. In contrast, let's look at an unpruned vine, a vine that hasn't been pruned for at least one winter. So in an unpruned vine, we don't have those same 1-year-old dormant buds at the base of the shoots any longer. Some shoots are actually starting their growth pretty high up off the ground. So the buds that we want to replace arm positions in the future, if we were to say bring this back into production, are typically latent buds, and they're positioned at the base of the 2-year-old wood or older wood, depending how long you haven't pruned this grapevine for. Latent buds tend to have fewer cluster primordia or inflorescence primordia. They are less strongly attached to the permanent wood of the grapevine and are typically less fruitful overall. With an unpruned vine, we also have a very inconsistent fruiting zone. Because the shoots start at different elevations off the ground, the clusters will also be at different elevations off the ground. Most primary clusters on a grapevine shoot occur at a certain distance up the shoot, typically around nodes 6, 7, or 8. If one shoot starts much higher than another, that means their 6th, 7th, or 8th nodes won't be aligned, and it'll be more difficult to manage the canopy for light exposure or exposure to spray regimes. All these things will become more difficult. Finally, with unpruned vines, you do have more permanent wood. All of those shoots from the year that you didn't prune become lignified or brown, and that could provide excessive habitat for pathogens like grapevine trunk diseases. When you want to bring it back to production, that also requires larger cuts if you want the fruiting zone and the height of the shoots to be more uniform following your return.
So, if you're looking at a mothballed vineyard without pruning, you're going to have to think about how are we going to bring it back to production when it's time to bring back to production. We know that grapevine buds, dormant buds, are most fruitful and most vigorous when they are 1 year old. Older than that, they become what are called latent buds and are kind of the backup shoots of the grapevine. They're not always the best shoots if they end up growing. So in this case, what we're seeing is we don't have a lot of those 1 year old buds near the cordon. You can see that here. There's not a lot of buds that are 1 year old at the base of this shoot or these shoots. And what that means is when we do come back to production, trying to get this fruiting zone here to be relatively uniform across height, we're going to have to rely on latent buds to replenish the wood that's going to become the new fruiting zone. What I mean by that is the buds that existed at the base of these shoots here. So you can see these shoots are 2 years old, or I guess they're canes now. At the base of these, or all across them really, there are buds. And these buds are dormant buds. However, after a couple years, they become latent buds because they never grew, which means that when they do grow, it's most likely that they're going to be weaker shoots with fewer clusters and weaker connections to the grapevine. And we're going to have to rely on those to replenish the standard design or architecture of this grapevine. And you can see that down here, if I look at the base of this old spur, the base of this old spur has a dormant bud right here. And this dormant bud is going to become a latent bud. And by the time it is the management goal to return to production, that latent bud is going to have to replenish that arm position there. So hopefully you can see how these changes in management strategy as far as livestock integration, changes in inputs, and the changes in your canopy management can contribute to the spectrum that we see of mothballing practices. They're not all the same. You should really decide what's best for your situation before you decide to mothball. And that means coming up with a plan before you decide to implement any mothballing strategies. Your plan should include things like, are you going to manage the canopy? Are you going to include the standard inputs like irrigation, or are you going to reduce them to a level that the grapevine requires but won't contribute to excessive growth? How long are you going to mothball the grapevine for? Because that really matters as far as the amount of photosynthate that grapevine will need the year before you bring it back into production. All of these things really matter for your management strategy in a mothballed vineyard, and you should decide on them well ahead of the implementation of your mothballing practices.
Part of the initial planning when deciding to mothball a vineyard is deciding how you're going to return those grapevines to production. You should consider this in your plans before designing the rest of your mothball strategy because it could affect how you apply those strategies throughout the mothballing period. To do this, we can identify some primary objectives that we'll have upon returning to production. Fruit production as soon as possible is one of those primary objectives because if you are returning those grapevines to producing fruit, you want them to make that fruit quickly. In order to do that, we need to have good pruning wood or at least some healthy dormant buds that are a year old. That can be challenging when you're mothballing a vineyard because we'll have a lot of unpruned wood that has a lot of older dormant buds that may be 2 years, 3 years old and are now considered latent buds. And as we just saw, latent buds are much less reliable, not just for pruning wood, but also for fruiting than a 1-year-old dormant bud is. To achieve this objective of getting to fruit production as quickly as possible and having healthy shoots, we need to reestablish those growing positions, or we need to plan to reestablish our growing positions that we had prior to the mothballing period. In order to do this, we need what I like to call pruning wood. We need wood that will grow well and will serve well as good two-bud spurs for the next season. Now that means you're probably not going to get back to fruit production the year that you decide that you're coming out of mothballing. But it does mean that you will have plenty of good pruning wood for the following winter and spring so that you have 1-year-old dormant buds that will be fruitful in year 2. We also want to make sure that we are limiting pest and disease risk when we're bringing these vines back to production. Reintroducing inputs like irrigation and fertilizer could lead to overcompensation of the grapevine through extra vigorous growth. That may or may not happen, but if it does happen, it does increase the habitat for the pest and disease population that is already there. We need to make sure we're still monitoring our pests and diseases in that vineyard, regardless of whether we're continually mothballing it or bringing it back into production.
So far, the strategies we've looked at are not the only strategies for mothballing, especially when considering return to production. Relying on previously established positions and the latent buds coming off those positions is one way to come back to production, but would take a couple of years. The first year being the establishment of new pruning wood. Those latent buds may not be as fruitful as buds that are 1 year old. And if that's the case, they might not have enough fruit to justify harvest, or that you would just want to harvest. It may be low quality fruit. So in those situations, what you want to do is allow that latent bud to grow as a standard shoot, allow it to turn into a cane over winter, and then prune it like you're going to prune every other shoot going forward, possibly to a 2-bud spur, possibly you would want to convert to cane pruning. But the point is that first year back into production, your primary goal should be to create and establish new wood for pruning. That second year, if you planned and managed your mothballing properly, you can possibly get fruit off of those vines. So mothballing is not only a process to establish the mothballed vineyard and a plan for that, it's also a process coming back into production.
So when returning from mothballing, our primary goal is to recover the permanent growing positions that we had prior to the mothballing implementation. This means that we may have to do large cuts to get back to the latent buds that are in the position to replace those arms. As you can see in this example, where we have a normal prune vine, those growing positions are constant and we don't have to replenish them most of the time. However, when recovering from mothballing, we can see that because the shoots grow at variable heights and we do want the fruiting zone to be relatively uniform, we do have to cut back pretty hard so that we have growing positions or new permanent growing positions at a more uniform height across the cordon. So this can be quite a challenge and it can be pretty dangerous as far as the risk of pests and diseases, particularly fungi like grapevine trunk diseases. But if we want to replenish those growing positions, this is one way to do that. We can also look at other options like top working. Top working is when you replace the scion with another scion most of the time. And what we do is we tend to cut the head or the trunk off of the grapevine and we place in 2 grafts of different scions. And this is another option, viable option for coming back from mothballing. This allows you to replenish not only the growing positions with a new scion, but also allows you to replace the scion variety if that is something you wish to do.
So when deciding to mothball your vineyard, the most important aspects are the planning of that mothballing, how long you plan on mothballing it for, how are you going to change your input strategy, how are you going to change the labor aspect of your vineyard management, and whether or not you want to integrate livestock. I mentioned this earlier, but really the most important aspect of mothballing a vineyard is managing the pests and diseases. In order to maintain the vineyard as a functional vineyard and also to not be a nuisance to surrounding vineyards, you need to manage your grapevines to reduce the pest pressure throughout the seasons that you plan on mothballing it. And you can do that through the strategies we've talked about. But management and monitoring are still very important to maintain that low pest pressure throughout the year. So that's it for this video about vineyard mothballing. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, I am the North Coast Integrated Vineyard Systems Advisor for University of California Cooperative Extension. Again, my name is Christopher Chen. You can contact me via the link or email in the description of this video. And thanks for joining us. See you at the next one.